outgrown its use. Been exhausted, and he wants to project a new term, and his idea is wildness, which I think is something that is maybe a wonderful idea for the potential of these moments of chaos, these moments of uncontrol within the grid of the city that Farah was talking about. So now we will be hearing from Christopher Lyon, who is an independent scholar, an editorial consultant and project manager, and the publisher of Lyon Art Books, based in Brooklyn. His recent books as author include Nancy Sparrow, The Work, from 2010, and he writes the Artful Volumes column for Book Forum magazine. He served as writer and editor at the Museum of Modern Art in New York for 10 years, and he first met Charles Simonds in 1981 when he wrote a profile of the artist for the Chicago Reader at the time of Simonds' first retrospective, organized by the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. So please join me in welcoming Chris. Thank you.
Good afternoon, big people. Last night, Professor Schiff teased Charles a bit, mentioning Charles's claim that he cannot write, and then reading a text that disproved it. And here's another one from Charles's recently published book, Dwelling. We live at the cuff of the time of the little people. In a peculiar inversion, although the little people appear incidental to our lives, and we happen upon them unexpectedly for an instant, we also glimpse their metaphorically long time as a hole in our world, an Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole into eternal time. What a marvelous, and I think original, figure of speech. We live at the cuff. The time of the little people is close at hand. It's up your sleeve, a kind of everyday magic trick. But they offer unexpected glimpses of the longue durée of the little people, and in a peculiar inversion, we turn the cuff, we go up the sleeve of the little people's time, and we thus experience our own cosmic insignificance, our smallness in the immensity of history. Two insights into Charles's work are contained in this brief passage. First is his engagement with what I will call historical time, past time represented or imagined. In museums and literature and archives and artifacts, we may distinguish it from existential time, processes, elapsed time, time actually experienced and documented, whether with creative or scientific intent. Secondly, this passage emphasizes the experience of the viewer, as opposed to focusing on art objects or to the process or idea informing an object of artwork. Temporal imagination and the viewer's actual experience are not separate issues in Simonds' work, but in fact are intimately intertwined. And so after discussing these issues, I will turn to a brief look at the mythology of creation that Simonds weaves from imagined historical time and the viewer's experience. Almost all the dwellings Simonds made in the 1970s exist in the past. The work is not lost or demolished in the sense that a building or a painting may have been destroyed by war or urban renewal. Existing in the past is the essence of their meaning. Such works sustain an existence in the little people's time, regardless of whether anyone other than Charles saw them. Charles' discoveries of them, in effect, generate events temporally upstream in the imagined world of the little people by implying that at some notionally prior point, they were in fact inhabited or built by the little people. On the Lower East Side, over a 5-year period or 7-year period, we've got to get our chronology straight here, Simonds created about 200 dwellings. Quote, they were everywhere and nowhere, Ted Castle wrote in 1983. Quote, they were underfoot and up in the sky, on ledges, nooks, and windowsills, unquote. A notable publicly visible example is the familiar dwelling in the stairwell of the Met Breuer a few blocks south, and that piece's companion dwelling on a ledge across Madison Avenue. They remain in those locations possibly because they can't be moved without being destroyed, but certainly their meanings, which depend entirely on them being noticed or discovered by the viewer, would be completely altered if they were moved. They then would be reduced to the status of art objects. So what was it like to come upon them innocently in the 1970s? We see from the few photographs that remain, that were taken, that the dwellings appeared to be abandoned ruins. Viewers at the time would immediately be aware of a time factor in the implied narrative world, the diegetic world of the little people. The scale, of course, signals that it's a representation, like a dollhouse or a model railroad. They then may ask themselves, how long has this been here? They judge the degree of ruin and wonder, is this scene, as represented, tens or hundreds of years old? If they happen to encounter several of the dwellings at different times, they might begin to realize that they're related by a narrative. In contrast to the diegetic time of the little people, the presence of the work in an urban street underlines the dwelling's ephemerality, its physical vulnerability. Like butterflies or babies, if the dwellings are exposed, unprotected, in a gritty urban setting, very likely they will not last long. In contrast to the imaginative dimension of time that the dwellings may evoke, which must be experienced individually, viewers' awareness of their actual situation in the street was social and often shared. Simonds stresses this shared sense of vulnerability in his recollections of the behavior, destructive, protective, of passers-by. It was a very different New York from the one we live in. Rudy Burkhart made a short film that shows Simonds working in various locations. In 1974, we saw a still from one of those earlier. In the films, we see him patiently constructing his little worlds while street life swirls around him like a violent cartoon. In one location, we see a bulldozer crashing across piles of rubble, while in a corner of the wreckage, Simonds makes little ruins. Two children climb across a heap of bricks, and Burkhart catches the astonished expression on one child's face as he sees what Simonds is doing. In another scene, a car bursts into flames in a vacant lot, and a pack of screaming kids dances around it, while in the foreground, Simonds, oblivious to the spectacle, wields his tweezers and tiny bricks. He recalls bystanders trying to protect a dwelling from curious kids. If you touch that, I'll whip your ass. So, along with the awareness of the dwelling's ephemerality, there's also a desire to protect them and sometimes to possess them, which inevitably will destroy them. Simonds sees in these cross currents a kind of life-death morality play. I'm quoting him. It's very sticky, like the clay, he continues. The work looks so precious and simple and innocent, but it's thorny intellectually and emotionally, because it's very dramatic on some level, end quote. Viewers want to take a dwelling home so it will be protected. Quote, what was there for everyone, you want for yourself. And the inevitable destruction of it has a kind of pathos. The pathos, he says, is built into even watching it being built. People are already imagining it being destroyed, so there's a kind of sadness. All sorts of things go on in there that I think carry endless little moral conundrums, end quote. And not only for the viewers, because there's a tenuous transactional aspect to the work as well. Simonds thought of the dwellings as gifts to the block or the community, and he was deeply involved in creating an actual space, La Placida, which has been mentioned, on the Lower East Side, not a fantasy, but a real place for children to play. In return, those who gathered around him often would share their fantasies and fears, their imaginative responses to the dwellings, and their support, offering coffee and food, even offering to buy the work, in Simonds' mind, helped to validate it. Nevertheless, Simonds thinks that the best way for the dwellings to be seen is when people happen upon them on the street after he's gone. They're just sort of walking along, he says, and what's that? At the time I first wrote about Simonds' work in 1981, I found it striking that he presented himself as being quite uninterested in whether or not the work was understood. In fact, he could be a bit belligerent on the topic. What strikes me now is that his descriptions amount to an informal typology of viewers. I'm quoting, you make something, right? Some people come by and immediately dive in and say, oh yeah, I know, the little people. That's just like if we were living at the corner of this big world and we were just incidental and time was going by. They take the scale and turn themselves into little people in relation to another world. Some people can just do that, end quote. This first category, then, are those who immediately, uncritically, are convinced by the visual rhetoric of the dwelling. A second category is children, and Charles always has had a special respect for their reactions to his work. Quote, little kids will dive right in and start to build a trail. They're right in there, end quote. Then there are the scoffers, often in Charles's telling art world types. Quote, this I remember very vividly. There were these moments where, because I was facing the wall back to the street, making my dwellings, I could sense people. Truckers would come by and say, hey, what's happening? What are you doing now? And then I would sense somebody would stand there a little timidly watching. Eventually I sort of teased them saying, well? And they'd say, what are you doing? I'd say, making homes for little people. And they'd think, whew, you are completely off the deep end. Now, first of all, Charles explains, minimalism was the style of the day, and there was no fantasy. There were no soft things, ephemeral things out of clay, which said craft. And I was cuckoo, evidently. The fourth category of viewers are those who engage with the work thoughtfully. Open quote. Now, the person who stops and then starts to think about this and lets it roll around in their head and starts to see little people at different places and starts to use this as a way of hinging reality, thinking about their time and place, is getting a lot more out of it, end quote. Charles then reverted to his own perspective, but that's all a coefficient of what they choose to let themselves do. I don't even open the door. I just provide the doorway. They choose whether they want to go in and how far they want to go, unquote. The distance, he asserts, from the thoughtful viewer may bring to mind the way that a therapist might distance herself from an analysand. Is that the word? Quote, I don't really have any obligation in the viewer's experience, Simonds claims, quote, or any control or any real interest. I mean, I have a relationship, me to the little people, that's very intimate and isn't going to get changed by whatever other people do. That's me and them. It doesn't have anything to do with you or anybody else, end quote. I take this to be a creative strategy in relation to viewers meant to push them toward their own imaginative creation. Recall that the dwellings are always uninhabited. Simonds wants to make a space that the viewer can possess imaginatively. Okay. So let's see, everything's, yeah, this. Viewers interpret the dwellings in terms of historical architectural types, and this is another aspect of their temporality. Simonds writes, metaphorically, through their primitiveness, he puts that in quotation marks, they represent our collective pasts. American Indian for us, North African for Arab immigrants in Paris, like as we see here, or Anatolian for Turkish immigrants in Berlin. Often the lost, sought-after homeland, end quote. Note the emphasis on immigrants. The tenements of the Lower East Side, where the little people's dwellings would most frequently be discovered, also was, of course, the primary destination of Jewish immigrants to the U.S. in the years around 1900. The emblematic wandering people are the Jews, a small people, exiled from their homeland who traditionally depended on the goodwill of their neighbors for survival. But one would not want to interpret this so narrowly. It may be sufficient simply to say, the little people are, in the words of Eliphaz in the book of Job, quote, them that dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed before the moth. Betwixt morning and evening they are destroyed. They perish forever without anyone regarding it. Is not their tent cord plucked up within them? They die, and that without wisdom. Each viewer will experience a distinct past, which nevertheless feels communal. Often when Simonds' work is mentioned to people in the U.S. who are familiar with it, they will mention North Native American cliff dwellings. Although what Simonds saw at first hand, I think, and Charles will correct me if I'm wrong, when he was a child and he and his brother accompanied his mother to New Mexico on a professional trip to Santa Fe, doesn't look much like his work. The specific structures he saw at that time, I believe, were homes dug into tufa, soft rock, in Frijoles Canyon, which is in the Bandelier National Monument near Los Alamos. Many of the dwellings, in fact, and certainly the majority of the portable objects Simonds made in the 1970s instead belong to what one might call a generic primitive style. And because of this, they can serve efficiently as screens on which viewers may project their own imaginative pasts. Turning the corner, Simonds' relationship with his peers of the 1960s and 70s with respect to issues of temporality introduces an art critical dimension to our talk. Evoking a historical past, whether actual or imagined, is almost unheard of in post-war American art. Alan Soundfist is an interesting partial exception to that, I would think. Commonly, Simonds' peers, in effect, wish to banish history, creating objects that notionally have no meaningful historical dimension. Environmental art, with which Simonds' work typically was lumped, was thought to have no past at all. To take almost at random a text from 1969, this one by Les Levine in Lucy's book, 6 Years, quote, "Environmental art can have no beginnings or endings. It can have no time. Time is the essential difference between theater and environmental art," end quote. Note the dreaded term theater, a cudgel to beat artists with. The notion that time as a historical construct, actual or fictional, would play any role in art making or art objects seems to have had pretty little traction in the 1960s, and that attitude persists. John Hogan, installations director for the Sol LeWitt Studio and director of the LeWitt Archive at Yale, told me recently that conservators are driven a little nuts when they come to him for advice about a LeWitt sculpture that, let's say, has had some damage to its surface. They want to know how best to restore it. John will say, well, just repaint it or build a replacement. John recalled that when he and Sol were installing the SF MoMA retrospective in 1999, Sol was asked how to restore several of the pieces, and he told them, and this is a direct quote, he wanted his work should always look contemporary without history. And the studio continues to follow that prescription, redo or remake as necessary, with the partial exception of a very small number of very, very early works. In other words, the object per se has no past. It lives, philosophically, if you will, in some eternal sunshine of the present moment. Simonds' focus on the viewer's imaginative experience of time and his concomitant attraction to organic metaphors distinguish him from his peers in the later 1960s and early 70s. Particularly, I would think, their most, to me, eloquent spokesperson, and that would be Robert Smithson, whose references to time and embrace of inorganic metaphors, for example, his use of the term crystalline, which Charles recalls from conversations with Smithson. In 1972, again, please correct me if the date is wrong, Smithson and Simonds exchanged visits to each other's New Jersey quarries, a day that I think resonates with implications for an art critical understanding of that period. Simonds recalled recently, quote, "Bob and I were friends, and I know that," oops, sorry. There we go. I'm going to go, sorry, I've got my slides a little mixed up here. "Bob and I were friends, and I know that the overt eroticism of my work fascinated him. For a while, he had an image of landscape body dwelling, the black and white one on above, I believe, that I'd given him up on his wall. We once planned a day together to explore our varying source landscapes. First, we went to my soft, wet, pink, sticky, quicksand-filled Sayreville, New Jersey clay pits with the top of a sunken 19th century steam shovel sticking up, which pleased Bob immensely, where we became encrusted in clay. Then we went to his hard, black, geometrically cut stone quarry above Montclair. Right through our feet, this made clear to us the intellectual and conceptual dominance in his work compared to the sensual, experiential, and visceral in mine. I viewed his work as two-dimensionally design-oriented and distanced from his materials in time and space, a conceptual reverie. The, quote, soft, wet, pink, sticky clay, the malleable material from which God, or the gods, made man in Sumerian, Jewish, Greek, and Muslim mythology, from which Rabbi Lowe made the golem, combines with the phallic steam shovel sticking up out of the pits. Simonds's material is essentially feminine, the mater in material, so to say, versus the Upper Montclair quarry, which is described by Smithson in his 1966 essay, The Crystal Land, where the hard, inorganic surfaces came right up through our feet to make clear the contrast of Bob's heady, intellectual, and conceptual approach, versus, versus Charles's organic and sensual one. Yet, I want to suggest that despite apparently fundamental philosophical differences, the outlooks of Simonds and Smithson are strikingly complementary and mutually revealing, sort of like a tarot card with both upright and reversed meanings. In fact, Simonds's work at Sayreville led him at one point to make tarot cards. In his 1966 essay, Entropy and the New Monuments, Smithson captures the prevailing attitude toward time of the later 1960s. The new monuments, he writes, quote, are not built for the ages, but rather against the ages. And I'll let you read the rest of this. A little further on, Smithson writes, time as decay or biological evolution is eliminated by many of these artists he's describing making the new monuments. This displacement allows the eye to see time as an infinity of surfaces or structures, or both combined, without the burden, no choice of word, of what Roland Barthes calls the undifferentiated mass of organic sensation. Like Simonds, then, Smithson links the notions of historic time and organic growth, or decay, but sees them as outmoded or as obstacles to creating infinite and instantaneous inorganic ideal forms. Physical processes like entropy have no inherent temporal dimension. Time is something people experience and measure more or less arbitrarily, and history is something they construct, and that's the activity Simonds is engaged in. Simonds is the latecomer and outlier in this process and saw himself in those terms. His style of practice, his tough attitude toward viewers, his insistence on thought being more important than objects, his anti-institutional stance, all this and much more put him squarely in the camp of his contemporaries. But the content of his work is startlingly different. Looked at structurally, together with Smithson, Judd, and many others, Simonds's work becomes precisely the differential, the conceptual negative of structural analyses of language and myth, which allows a definition of existential time in contrast to historical time, of inorganic visual metaphors in contrast to organic ones. So I want to suggest that by putting himself as far from accepted content as he did, Simonds in fact put his works of the 1970s at the center of fundamental critical concerns. Most important, what's the story we're trying to tell? So what are the origins of Simonds's engagement with historical time and emphasis on viewer experience? What does the creative mythology of the little, where does the creative mythology of the little people originate? And who is the artist in relation to the little people? And from what perspective does he see them? I think we get a pretty interesting view if we consider Simonds's own characterizations of them, repeated by Charles last night. Quote, even though they appear to be in the past, they live in the future in my mind. They are alive, prolific, and profligate. I often use biological metaphors for their behavior, analogies to infections, infestations, and epidemics, as well as the obvious social analogies to invasive, conquering imperial activities that apply to a people, end quote. Walter Benjamin, in a celebrated passage in his thesis on the philosophy of history, written in 1940, the year in which he committed suicide, convinced that he was about to be turned over to the Nazis, interprets a 1920 drawing by Paul Paul Klee, Angelus Novus, which Benjamin had owned since 1921. It represents, he says, the angel of history. The quotation is projected here. I won't read it, but just go on to note that like the angel of history, and I have to stop and say, the creature hanging in midair in the lobby suddenly looked very different to me when I started thinking about this. Like the angel of history, as Benjamin describes him, Simonds faces the past, his back turned to the street where the present unspools, as he ruminates on the future where the little people live. Ruin upon ruin appears in front of him, which sounds like a concise description of Simonds' activities in the years he was creating ruined dwellings. But a storm is blowing from paradise, a reference to Eden, to which the angel of history cannot return and from which man has been exiled. What kind of angel is this, we wonder? One of God's stalwart faithful or a rebel angel? Not all art comes from art. The dwellings of the little people may have many sources, but the impulse to create an epic narrative has a specific origin in Charles's biography. In 1963, he matriculated at the University of California at Berkeley. There he studied studio art, but I think he would agree that his most significant intellectual encounter was with a brilliant and controversial young literary scholar named Stanley Fish, with whom Simonds has maintained a friendship all these years. Fish was at that time writing his landmark study of Paradise Lost, titled Surprised by Sin, The Reader in Paradise Lost, which is dedicated to his students at Berkeley in the years Simonds was one of them. Briefly, Fish sees Milton as making the reader the subject of the poem, its center of reference. Milton's aim, Fish thought, was to educate the reader to his position as a fallen man and his distance from innocence, and to recreate in the mind of the reader the drama of the fall of man's loss of innocence, to make the reader fall as Adam did again. Or, as Charles puts it, quote, "It's like the experience of reading the text is giving you the lesson that you're supposed to know." Fish's elevation of the reader, as opposed to close textual analysis practiced by the then prevailing new criticism, was an early and influential example of what became known in the US as reader response criticism, and in Europe as reception aesthetics. And Fish became the most prominent American advocate of this approach. Now, keep that in mind and consider that Simonds was having this experience in the midst of the first great student uprising of the 1960s, the Berkeley free speech movement, which he witnessed in his sophomore year and took part in. He recalls it as an extraordinary moment of political theater, students outmaneuvering the powers that be, challenging authority. Inside Stanley Fish's class, the rebel angels led by Satan are defying God. Outside, the students led by Mario Savio and others are defying the authority of the university and the state of California. Soon, jackbooted state troopers will arrest 800 of them. Simonds sometimes uses the term lever, as in the tool used with a fulcrum to move a great weight, when discussing his ability with the dwellings to leverage very big ideas with a modest expense of creative energy. It's a term he may first have heard used politically in Berkeley. Savio, in a famous speech on the steps of Sproul Hall, which preceded the mass arrest, said, "And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and on the wheels and on the levers and upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate that the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all." Kind of sounds like Bernie Sanders. Charles recalls the occasion when Savio was wrestled off stage at a convocation held at the Greek amphitheater up on a hill above campus. Quote, "I remember this moment where everybody just streamed down from that hill, down into the campus, and it was all over. I mean, it was like chaos. And you know, there was no going back at that point," end quote. He might have used similar language to describe the fall of Satan and his legions through chaos to hell. Certainly, Simonds says, the free speech movement changed everything in my life. I mean, all of a sudden, you realize that you're walking in history. You're part of history, and you knew it. Certainly, it garnered for me a tremendous belief in activism and being able to do whatever the hell you want. You know what you believe and let the chips fall. That cemented the problem for me. Paradise Lost, as Fish taught him to read it, quote, had a tremendous influence on my way of thinking. The story is about time and space, largely, he continued, and the story allowed me to think in those terms and not necessarily in terms of discrete objects. It led him to understand that he was facing a life's work, a magnum opus, something that's big, and you're just filling in little parts of it as you go, to try and tell the story. Somehow you need this structure that's going to allow a sense of what's going on. Paradise Lost offered me that kind of scale of perspective and ambition. It allowed him, he says, to get a sense of, quote, what is the job that you're out there to do, end quote. Well, the richness and ironies of the relationship between the little people and Paradise Lost are limitless. The little people are, in some sense, exiles, and Simonds is, his phrase is making home, as he puts it, for them. The satanic antagonists of Paradise Lost in its early chapters are also exiles, aiming to return home, the place of exile being hell. Further on, of course, Adam and Eve are exiled from paradise in the dwellings. Twin themes of exile and making home are being played out on a physically miniature, but conceptually vast stage. Okay. So, a criticism often leveled at Stanley Fish with regard to his understanding of how Paradise Lost functions for the reader is that Milton's reader, as Fish conceives him, keeps falling for Satan's line. This has annoyed many of Fish's actual readers. One critic among many, William Kerrigan, remarked that Fish's reader has, quote, a remarkable appetite for being duped. These are deep waters of literary controversy, and I mention it only to point out a certain parallel between Fish's Puritan readers, and Simonds's street-smart viewers of the 1970s. Just as one can't be continuously surprised by sin, one can't expect to be repeatedly surprised to run across dwellings of the little people. Once they had seen a dwelling or two, and it wouldn't be unusual to meet the maker in those years, viewers' understanding of them is permanently altered. Despite Simonds' intentions, they became a kind of art. His project of the 1970s necessarily had to wind down. One way of looking at the content of Simonds' work of the later 1970s and possibly beyond is as a kind of meta-commentary on the philosophical, psychological, and art world concerns that are initially addressed by the dwellings and the fragmentary mythology of the little people. A more extended narrative, though not a unified one, is offered by Circles and Towers Growing. Let's see if I get, oops, okay, we'll get there. A set of 12 landscapes made in 1977 and 1978, I believe, each about 2.5 feet square, which were the centerpiece of Simonds' first retrospective exhibition, organized by John Neff at Chicago's MCA, which opened in November 1981. When I first had the chance to spend time with these works, I was struck by the extent to which the series as a whole seemed to resemble the Kabbalistic cosmic tree, the diagram of emanations of the Sephirot, the aspects of the Ein Sof, of God and his potential being prior to the manifestation of his being. Most commonly, there are 10 elements in the diagram. The myth of the unfolding of God's stern and merciful, his masculine and feminine sides, indicated by the branching of the diagram left and right, can be understood as a kind of mythology of creation, and in fact, a psychology of creation, with God on the analyst's couch. We could be here until next Saturday discussing the many details of Circles and Towers Growing that intersect with Jewish mystical concepts and with Freudian mythology and with the Christian mythology so eloquently retailed in Paradise Lost, and Sumerian mythology and Native American myth. But the details of the little people's mythology, so far as we can see them, particularly, I think, resonate with Jewish mystical thought and Christian thought influenced by it. To choose just one aspect of Circles and Towers, and of Charles's creative thought generally, a feminine creative principle as a counterpart to the male principle is a pervasive feature of Charles's objects in this series, and of his material. He mentioned last night how the colors of clay, such as pink or gray, may signify feminine or masculine aspects of work. So I'm running through them in sequence now. So you've seen the first one. These are numbers 2 and 3 in the sequence. And we see the feminine principle leading the way. Number 2 shows breast-like forms emerging, some with labia or labial openings. In number 3, we see a phallic form beginning to emerge. In number 4, the rounded forms are penetrated by or encrusted with structural elements, and we sense the male principle asserting itself. There are 2 iterations in Circles and Towers of implied narratives of growth and decay, as if to suggest that there is not one story, but multiple stories. The final 4 elements may be thought of as a couple of freestanding, these are 7 and 8. The final 4 elements may be thought of as a couple of freestanding 2-object narratives. And in this sense, they parallel the Kabbalistic tree in leading us to 2 different conclusions. A hopeful, feminist conclusion in number 10 on the right, and a destructive masculine conclusion with number 11 having the parenthetical title, this is a detail of number 10, the parenthetical title, Ritual Furnace. So numbers 9 and 10 are a kind of hopeful feminine coda to Circles and Towers, while numbers 11 and 12 are kind of a grim male conclusion ending in complete destruction. As if to say, after number 8, there's a fork in the road. You could go this way or that way. Like Milton, the Kabbalists were trying to explain how an all-encompassing God made room within himself for creation, and in so doing, a space for evil, and how God could contain the seemingly conflicting qualities of justice and mercy. Quoting Gershom Scholem, it is God's withdrawal into himself that makes possible the existence of something other than God and his pure essence. The Kabbalah had its great second flowering in the aftermath of the expulsion from Spain because, in the wake of that catastrophe, as Scholem explains, quote, it supplied an answer to the questions of the meaning of exile and the vocation of the Jews in the world, end quote. That vocation would be, by small acts of goodness, to restore God to himself. I'm vastly oversimplifying a rich and complex and often contradictory body of myth, but you get the idea. This is a narrative philosophy of creative activity. Both the Kabbalistic and Miltonic narratives are extremely powerful, in part because they tell unified stories. Milton's a powerful epic, the Kabbalah, what Scholem has called an abstract mythology, but they have the same subject. In Milton's words, to justify the ways of God to man, a phrase Charles repeated to me recently. Until the early 1970s, it was still possible to believe in a unified story of progressive art. The Museum of Modern Art was still committed to that well into the 1980s. Another wind from paradise blowing us ever forward. Simonds got off that train in 1970 or so, rented a 3-wheel delivery bicycle, and began making ephemeral little dwellings in Lower Manhattan. It is a great strength of Simonds' creative response that the mythology he began to create then is not unified. A really interesting aspect of his work in relation to his contemporaries and to the multiple narrative art world that followed is that, unlike Smithson, Simonds does not subscribe to a single concept of time, such as Smithson's entropy or the historical determinism of earlier critics. In his only sustained piece of fictional writing, Three Peoples, written in 1972, Simonds imagines a set of cultures that can be distinguished by their attitudes toward history. Each of them is represented by an ideogram, not words. The first, now I practiced this at home, it goes this way, 3 lines in different directions. That first people are obsessed by the past and tend to get lost in it. That people seems most closely related to the migrating little people of the dwellings. The people who live in a circle exist in an eternally renewable cycle, a kind of permanent present tense. The spiral people, whose ideogram somewhat resembles Smithson's spiral jetty, are willfully focused on the future to their ultimate destruction. They may be represented best by the 2 masculine here are the people who live in a circle, right? And then here is the end of circles and towers growing with the final scene of destruction. So you may have noticed that in the Kabbalistic tree, after branching into stern and merciful channels, the masculine and feminine, the tree is reunited with a central stem. No such resolution happens in Simonds' larger narrative. These paths cannot be reconciled as one narrative. Circles and towers growing simply ends in ruin. The multiple narrative world emerging around Charles in the early 1970s, led by the rise of the women's movement, can never be stuffed back into a single dominant myth of modern art. Charles, who calls himself a fantasist, implicitly recognizes in his work the failure of that story. That's a great gain for reality. It's also a great loss for myth. Paradise Lost is a mountain the little people will never climb. Benjamin's new angel may also be interpreted as the cherubim God placed east of Eden to block the way to the tree of life. As with our ancestors exiled from paradise, Charles has sent the little people forth to till the ground from which they were taken. Home is not on their itinerary. Thank you.
So I think we have time for just one question, if there's a burning one.
Burning.
Otherwise, we can, of course, always save the discussion for our coffee break.
Thank you, Chris.